Okay, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this morning. My name is Shannon Murray, and I'm the program coordinator for the Northwest Fire Science Consortium. We have a few brief housekeeping items to go over. Please note that we are recording, and we'll post the video on the Northwest Fire Science Consortium website for future reference. All participants have been muted for this webinar. If you have any technical difficulties, please reach out to the co-host through chat, and we will do our best to help you. We will have a Q&A session at the end of Jim's presentation, so please use either the Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screen or the chat, and we'll be monitoring that and using that for the Q&A. So please add your questions there at any time. We're excited to have Jim Cronin with us today to give a webinar titled Fieldwork from Afar, Using Remote Sensing Tools to Inventory Fuels and Fire Behavior. Jim is a forester at the Pacific Wildland Fire Sciences Lab in Seattle, Washington. He coordinates field data collection for scientists on the fire and environmental research applications team and has been involved with research on fuels and fire behavior for 20 years. So with that, I'll hand it over to you, Jim.
All right, thanks, Shannon. And thanks everyone for attending. This is pretty exciting. I always like to talk about the fieldwork that we're doing here at the lab. So I will, without further ado, get started with this presentation. Give me 1 second here. Okay, so like Shannon said, the title of this talk is Fieldwork from Afar. And basically, I'm going to be discussing some of the ways that our team has been using remote sensing to characterize fuels for the wildland areas. So the talk is basically going to be divided up into 3 sections. First, I'm just going to give sort of an overview of remote sensing and some of the different sensors that our lab has been using recently. And then I'll get into into fuels and how our lab tends to measure fuels and how we're starting to use remote sensing to characterize fuels. So I'm going to go over a couple of projects that we've been doing. The second part will be more about fire behavior and using that fuels and fire behavior data to help improve the sort of next generation of fire behavior models that are in development. So to get started, just a little overview of where I work and what I do. I am part, as Shannon said, I'm part of the Fire and Environmental Research Applications team. We are at the Pacific Wildland Fire Sciences Lab in Seattle. And the team has been around for several decades and really concentrates on developing tools for land managers that can help with characterizing fuels, understanding fire effects, smoke emissions, and fire behavior. And I've been working as a forester for about 5 years, and my main job here is really to coordinate and perform all of the field work that the different scientists at the lab want to do. So I've got a great field crew. I really love the work. I love getting outside, and it's pretty fun to use some of these new sensors to try and characterize fuels. So for those of you who know about the Pacific Wildland Fire Sciences Lab and FARA, we have a lot of tools that are out there to help fire managers and land managers, and they're listed at the top here. So many of you, if you have dealt with fuels and fire behavior, some of the software products that we have out there, or websites, include the Fuels Characteristic Classification System, FCCS. It's been around for a long time. The Photo Series, Consume, FEPS, and Pile Calculator, all tools that FARA has developed that are pretty widely used. And all of those products are wrapped up into Fuel and Fire Tools, FFT, which is a software program that can be used for characterizing fuels, estimating emissions, predicting fire behavior. And so those products have been around for a long time, and they're pretty widely used across the country. I should also mention that here at the lab, there's also another team, Airfire, that has a number of products that are are out there, including Blue Sky and the AirNow website. And AirFire and FARA work together quite a bit. FARA is, like I said, focused on fuels and fire behavior, and AirFire is more focused on smoke dispersion and the atmospheric component of I guess smoke dispersion. So smoke forecasting. Blue Sky is used for that, and AirNow is a website they've developed so folks can see air quality information. So before I get into remote sensing, I just really want to quickly touch on fire behavior models. I'm going to throw on the terms operational models and CFD models quite a bit here, and just want to generally talk about what these two kinds of models are. So when I say operational fire models, I'm talking about fire behavior models that are in use today. These models like Behave Plus, Flame Map, FS Pro, and Farsight are semi-empirical in nature. And what I mean by that is they're using a lot of relationships that have been studied in the field or in the lab, where you look at how one environmental factor impacts fire behavior, and they're usually done within some kind of confined set of variables, right? So they're not looking at how wind affects fire behavior all the way up until an infinite wind speed. They're designed within certain parameters. So these models have been around for quite a while, especially Behave Plus was developed in the early 1980s. The other three listed there are newer, and they are spatial in nature, whereas Behave Plus just produces tables that tell you what the fire behavior should be like. The other three are able to spatially represent how fire will move across the landscape. On the other hand, we have CFD models, and these models are not, to my knowledge, used operationally yet. They're still very much in development. And when I say CFD, I mean computational fluid dynamics models. So these are more process-based models. They include all of the physics in combustion and fluid dynamics that are necessary to know how fire will interact with the environment. So that includes the fuels and the surrounding atmosphere. And those images below just give you an idea of what the outputs of those models look like. Flame Map, FS Pro, and Farsight have more of a map-based approach to show how fire can move across the landscape. Computational fluid dynamics models, or CFD models, can actually visualize how fire will move through fuels. And they can also visualize how smoke will move through the air. So just wanted to get those out of the way first, so you all know what I'm talking about when I refer to these two kinds of models. So just a quick review of remote sensing. I'm sure everyone here has a pretty good understanding of what remote sensing means and what a lot of the tools available are. But just in case, I want to just quickly review what I mean when I'm talking about remote sensing and sort of give some context here. So go way back to 1858. That was the first time that remote sensing was actually used. There was a guy in France, Gaspard Felix Tournichon, and he had the idea of taking a hot air balloon and taking photos above towns to map streets. So this is the first real application of remote sensing. And I've got to give this guy credit, because not only did he have to take the hot air balloon up to take the photos, but he also had to bring a darkroom up there to develop the photos. The photo on the right there, that's the first surviving, or the only, or I guess it's the first photo we have of remote sensing. This is Boston. It was taken 2 years later in 1860. So remote sensing is the earliest applications is basically Google Maps is using sensors to map streets. Fast forward about 80 years, and this is really the first example I could find, at least, of people using remote sensing to map fuels. And this is out of a paper in the Journal of Forestry from 1941 by Howard Lee. I can't remember exactly where he was working, somewhere in the West. And he came up with a method of using, basically bringing aerial photos out into the field and then literally drawing maps of fuel types onto the aerial photos. And they would bring stereographic equipment, as you can see on the right there, in order to visualize topography. And they would map fire hazard basically as a function of topography and fuels. So definitely what we would call a supervised classification of fuels, very labor intensive. And there's just a quote in the article. I thought that was pretty interesting. The quote is, "Most workers with aerial photographs are sooner or later confronted with the realization that field work cannot entirely be dispensed with, regardless of the extravagant claims of some advocates of the aerial photographic method." And I just thought that was funny, because that is a quote I hear a lot in regards to some of the tools that we have today. And it's I'm not sure if field work will be going away anytime soon. Some of the sensors we have today are pretty astounding in the detail that they can capture, but interesting to see that idea of sensors replacing field work has at least been around for about 80 years. Some of the sensors, I'm not obviously going to go through all of the sensors, but these are some of the ones that we've been using. There's two kinds of sensors. There are active sensors and passive sensors. Active sensors are devices that shoot out basically some kind of energy, and then that energy bounces off of an object and returns to the sensor, and the sensor can use the amount of time that energy takes to leave the sensor and come back, along with the intensity values, to essentially map things around it. And so examples of active sensors are LiDAR, light detection and ranging, and radar, radio detection and ranging. Radar has been around for quite a long time. LiDAR is relatively new, especially in vegetation mapping. We don't really use radar, but we have been using LiDAR quite a bit. Passive sensors, these are probably terms a lot of you are familiar with. A lot of the sensors that we use are in the visible light range or the infrared range, and infrared can be divided up into the near infrared, shortwave infrared, and thermal infrared, as far as the ranges that are useful to those of us that are trying to map fuels and fire behavior. The near infrared can give you pretty good information on plant health. Shortwave infrared is mainly been used for geological applications, but we are starting to look at its utility for assessing fuel moisture. And then thermal infrared can give you information about temperature of objects, so very useful for measuring fire behavior. And in addition to the sensors, you have remote sensing platforms. So very quickly, there's three basic kinds of platforms where sensors can be located on. Objects that are orbiting the Earth, satellites. There are airborne sensors. So once you put those sensors on an aircraft, they would be considered. And then there are ground-based sensors. So putting a sensor on a tripod or your cell phone, for instance, would be considered a ground-based sensor if you're taking photos with it. UAVs, we have a little UAV up there above the trees. That's sort of in the in-between between airborne and ground-based, because they can fly so low. They can capture detail in a similar way that ground-based sensors can. So operationally, a lot of products that we have for fire management, they are using products developed from either airborne or spaceborne sensors. So aerial photos, for instance, have been around for quite a long time. And then the Landsat photos have produced a tremendous amount of, I'm sorry, not photos. The Landsat satellite images have produced a lot of vegetation and fuels maps. Obviously, the higher up you are, the lower resolution you have. And so that's the main difference between the products from these sensors. So just an example of a product that we're all familiar with from remote sensing is Landfire. That is derived mainly from satellite data, and it's produced at a resolution of 30 meters. And this map these are the FCCS fuel beds from land fire that have been mapped across the lower 48. So what are some of the advances in remote sensing that have caused FARA to adopt them more as a way to measure fuels in the field? LiDAR is certainly one of them. It's actually been around for quite a while at this point, and I believe it's been used to at least people have been exploring its use for measuring vegetation for about 20 years. It's become a lot cheaper to buy LiDAR units, and they've become a lot smaller. So that's another thing, is miniaturization of sensors. A lot of these sensors were typically quite large, and so mounting them on something like a small drone that you can see in this photo was not feasible. So just the miniaturization of sensors has helped tremendously as far as getting very detailed information. There's been a lot of advances in drones or UAS over the past several years, and they seem to be getting better and better all the time. Some of the advances that have made them really useful for measuring fuels at fine scales has just been the ability for autonomous flight. I remember talking to someone from the Nature Conservancy about their attempts to collect aerial photos with model airplanes in the 1980s by strapping a camera to the bottom of it and having a remote switch on the camera, and just hoping that it would capture a picture just at just the right time so that they could get more high resolution images of their preserves. Now we can plug in a very detailed flight path into a drone and just turn it on and let it go up, and it will execute that flight path almost perfectly. They also have object avoidance, so you could even theoretically put these flight paths below a tree canopy and have it autonomously fly in the understory. UAS has been improved a lot to carry higher payloads and have longer lasting batteries. So that improved flight time has been a real key to improvements in being able to collect data. They're typically around 20 to 30 minutes now, and so that means that for each flight, it's hard to get data across larger areas, but flight time is definitely increasing with drones. And so in the future, we'll be able to have drones collect data for larger and larger areas. So what that means is that right now we can collect data from more experimental areas to verify how well they're collecting data. But I think in the future, we'll be able to actually use them to map entire management units. Some other advances, image processing software has definitely been improving. Being able to merge images is getting easier and faster. Computing power is less of an issue. And then the cost of sensors and UAS has certainly gotten cheaper over time. And those advances as far as cost also extend to, I have GNSS there, which is essentially GPS. GNSS is a general term that describes all of the satellite constellations that different countries use for global positioning. So GPS is the US-based satellite system. But a lot of GNS systems will use satellites for different countries. So European Union, Russia, China, and the US all have their own satellite constellations. That increase in satellite constellation, the increase in accuracy of GNSS, and the lower cost means that we can really pinpoint within just a few centimeters of accuracy points on the ground. And that very much helps with georeferencing some of this fine scale imagery and overlaying different kinds of imagery together. So those are some of the advancements in remote sensing that have been very helpful for mapping and characterizing fuels. So next, that's pretty much the introduction to remote sensing. Next, I'm going to really get into some of the ways that FARA has been characterizing fuels. So this is a more traditional way that FARA has been characterizing fuels, and it's really has been this photo really encapsulates most of the field work that FARA has done in the past. And admittedly, we're a little bit late to the party as far as remote sensing. But typically when we think of characterizing fuels, it is really a very manual process. Like these guys have like literally the world's largest ruler out here trying to measure the diameter of shrub canopies. And that is still very much today, even with remote sensing, is part of how we measure fuels, is just physically going out and measuring dimensions and biomass of fuels and fuel moisture. So remote sensing platforms, in the introduction, I talked about how a lot of the typical products that we use today are derived from spaceborne and airborne remote sensing platforms. Well, the miniaturization of sensors has allowed us to put them on UAS and fly them much closer to the surface of the ground, which gives us much higher resolution of fuels. If you think of your cell phone being 1,000 feet in the air, you're really not going to get good resolution of all of the different vegetation on the ground. But if you are at ground level, you're getting much better resolution. So some of these sensors, like thermal imaging cameras and LiDAR units, which used to be gigantic and would never fit on a drone, are now small enough to fit on a drone. And their price is also much cheaper. So it's feasible to actually buy these things now. So a lot of where FARA has gone as far as assessing fuels has been using these ground-based systems, either devices that can be mounted on a tripod or mounted on UAS. And this is just, I'm sure many of you have seen this before. It's a LiDAR point cloud. This is looking down at a prescribed burn unit on the Fish Lake National Forest in Utah. And this just gives you an example of the incredible amount of detail that you can capture with, in this case, LiDAR. And so this is a subalpine fir aspen forest on the edge of a lake. And like I said, this was all collected with terrestrial LiDAR scanner. So these scanners were ground-based. And you can, if I keep zooming in, you would actually be able to see individual leaves on some of these trees. So just an incredible amount of detail in the imagery. And it's also three-dimensional. Hopefully let me continue. There we go. So that's a LiDAR scan, gives you three-dimensional point clouds. This photo on the left here, I just did this with my cell phone. This is a photogrammetry scan, and the difference between the two is LiDAR is an active scanner. It sends out laser pulses, and then the return beam, it assigns X, Y, and Z values to all those points, so you know the exact location of every single point that comes out of the LiDAR scanner, and that is it can be thousands of points per square foot, so just tons of data there. Photogrammetry scans a little bit less data. It's just using the position of all the photos to assign points in it, and software programs that are generally referred to as structure for motion will use the angle and distance of the individual photos to create these point clouds. So this photo this image on the left is a point cloud of a tree seedling that was in my backyard. And the real crux as far as assigning of characterizing fuels with this imagery is assigning relevant values to these points. So that lower image there, you can see each individual point in that point cloud. And on the left, you can see the stem. And on the lower right, you can see the green of the leaf. And so looking at that, it's whether you're looking at the image on the upper part there or the lower part, it's very clear what is a stem or a leaf just by looking at it. But how do you feed that information into a fire behavior model? That's very different. There's no way that it's going to know what those are just in the same way that we can know them by looking at them. So the real crux of this is assigning fuel properties to each of those points. And so we have intrinsic fuel properties and we have extrinsic fuel properties. So as far as extrinsic fuel properties, how can we how can we develop algorithms and models that can see that tree seedling and know how much it weighs? And how can we develop models that can see those points that mean a leaf and assign surface to area volume ratio, heat combustion, heat content, mineral content, all of these properties that are within a leaf or a stem or a pine cone that have a tremendous influence on how different objects would burn. So that's really what we are focused on when we are using remote sensing to characterize fuels, is figuring out how to take this imagery and assign values to it. Another thing about this imagery is it provides incredible detail. You can see with that photogrammetric image in the past slide, there's probably dozens of points for just a single leaf. This brings up the question of how much data is too much data. The more we look at something, the more detail we'll see, whether we're looking at aerial photo or a drone photo or a cell phone photo or a microscopic photo. You keep zooming in, you keep seeing more detail. And so one of the questions that we have to answer is how much data is too data? What's actually relevant for these fire behavior models, where the purpose is just simply to model fire behavior at a scale that is relevant to fire managers? Do we need to know how much variation there is in a leaf, or do we just need to know how much variation there is in that tree or that shrub? And so there has been quite a bit of research into this, mainly using these CFD models to see how fire behavior changes when you rearrange vegetation differently on the landscape. And from what a lot of this research shows us is that at least at the tree level, that matters. If you aggregate trees differently, it will produce differences in fire behavior. And this is a study done by Russ Parsons and others at the Mozilla FireLab a few years back, where they used one of the CFD models. I believe there's two of them, FireTech and WFDS. I believe they use FireTech to look at how fire would behave differently if they aggregated trees differently. And you can see the green is trees and the white is open space. So the surface fuels under the trees is going to be primarily comprised of needles, and the open space is primarily grass. And you can see there's quite a bit of difference in how the fire spreads over these areas. I should say these are 400 by 400 meters. So if this was a land fire map, you may have several dozen pixels that show you what fuels are like across this area. And the maps would probably look exactly the same for all 12 of these simulations. But here, these are looking at the tree level, so it's much higher resolution. And you can see in the more open areas, the fire is spreading in a more narrow pattern, and that's likely because there's more wind in the understory that's pushing it faster, and there's less flanking fire. Whereas in the lower panels there, where there's more trees, you can see more spread with the flanking fire. And so at least it is important to look at the tree level. And just for anyone that's been who's worked on prescribed fires or fire suppression, you can see fire behavior change very quickly over small scales. This is a prescribed fire in Oregon. The photo on the left was taken about 20 seconds before the photo on the right. And as the fire moves from a very small opening with some dense volatile shrubs to a little patch of saplings, you can see a pretty dramatic change in fire behavior. And so differences like this over an entire landscape with a larger fire could conceivably have pretty big impacts on how that fire behaves. And the same could be said here for topography. Small scale changes in topography could have some pretty important implications for how fire behaves. So as far as our approach, there is some information to justify looking at fuels on a finer scale. So a couple of projects that FAIR has been involved with recently that are using remote sensing to assess fuels. One is the 3D Fuels project, and the other is the Integrated Data Sets project. So 3D Fuels is a project being managed by Susan Pritchard, who's a scientist at our lab. It is funded by the Department of Defense through their CERTA program, the Strategic Environmental R&D program. And the goal of this this project is really one, to produce high resolution three-dimensional fuel beds for CFD models, but more broadly to produce a process for using all of these different kinds of sensors to map fuels in really the most detail that we possibly can, so that these CFD models have as much information as possible to look at fuels. And then if we find that we need to basically dumb down the process, we can back off and map fuels at a more coarse scale resolution. As far as the integrated data sets projects, that's being managed by Ruddy Mell, who is also a scientist at our lab. And that's a much smaller project that's just being funded by the lab. And the goal of this project is to produce data sets that can be used to evaluate CFD models. So just like any kind of model, it doesn't matter how impressive the outputs are, they still need to be evaluated to identify how accurate they are. And fire behavior data sets are notoriously hard to come by just because fire is such a fleeting process. There's obviously some hazard in trying to collect data from them. And so really the goal of this project is to try to identify a way to fairly easily use drones to collect fuels and fire behavior data that then can be used to evaluate CFD model performance. So I'm going to start off with talking a little bit about 3D fuels. This project has been going on for a couple of years now. It is really one of, I think, FAIR's really first forays into using remote sensing to characterize fuels. What this project is doing is using remote sensing instruments and field data collection to characterize fuels at several different scales, with the hope that we can create models and algorithms to use fine scale fuels data, to relate fine scale fuels data to more coarse scale fuels data, and then use those relationships to essentially use airborne LiDAR and other kinds of airborne sensors to map fuels at large scales at fine detail. So we have several sites for that project, and we are integrating airborne LiDAR with UAS-based photogrammetry, terrestrial LiDAR, handheld photogrammetry, and finally field data. And so all of those things can be layered together to look for relationships between them. And so the hope is that all of that can be scaled up to just being able to map fuels with sensors mounted on aircraft. And so the boxes on the right here and the upper left, that is airborne LiDAR. Upper right, that's photogrammetric image of a forest. The center there, that's terrestrial LiDAR. So again, you can just see the incredible detail of the forest understory you can get from TLS. Lower left image, that's handheld photogrammetry. Essentially, those are just cell phone photos that have been stitched together to create a three-dimensional image. So very high resolution three-dimensional images. That's a point cloud, so you could use that image to measure the distance of that log, and you can use it to characterize different fuels like downwitty debris, shrubs, grasses, and pine needles. And then finally on the right there, lower right, that's a technique that we're using to assess fuels in 3 dimensions, and I'll get into that on the next slide here. This has been a lot of what our field crew has been up to over the past couple of years. Is within these larger 200 by 200 meter plots where we're using all kinds of remote sensing equipment to assess fuels. We have these smaller 5 by 5 meter plots, and from these plots, they're very intensively sampled with TLS, terrestrial LiDAR scans all around this plot. And within that 5 by 5 meter plot, there are 5 half meter by half meter plots. You can see those, how they're laid out in that photo on the lower left there. Within each 5 by 5 meter plot, we are collecting what is called voxel data. It was developed by Christy Hawley at the Southern Research Station. The sampling technique, and what it essentially is a cube. It's half meter by half meter on a side. It's 1 meter tall, and there's there's a tray with, or not a tray, but a strata that you can move up and down that has you can see in the center photo there are these pins that you slide across it to create 10 by 10 centimeter squares, and that tray moves up and down at 10 centimeter increments. So you have 10 cubic centimeter cubes. Within each of those cubes, there are 256 in that entire cube. We measure the presence and absence of each fuel type in there. So shrubs, grasses, litter, pine cones, whatever happens to be in that cube, we know whether it's present or not. And then we actually collect that biomass from each strata. And so that can be, we can then overlay that physical data with the LiDAR point clouds and use that to assign things like biomass or fuel type to the point cloud within that 10 cubic centimeter voxel. And then you can, that photo on the right there, lower right, you can see what it looks like we're actually collecting fuels from those voxels. There's 5 10 by 10 squares on the bottom there where we've collected the actual litter layer and the duff layer. So it's very focused, intensive field work, and it can be matched up with the LiDAR point clouds itself. One of the limitations of this that we've known from the start is that it is virtually impossible, if not impossible, to collect any kind of data below the litter layer with these sensors. They cannot see underground, basically. And that's unfortunate because for a lot of systems, the duff layer is a huge component of the biomass. And for example, in ponderosa pine forest, it can be up to 60% of the surface fuel biomass. And it is a huge contributor, not so much to the intensity of fire behavior, but to the amount of smoke that is produced. So the inability for sensors like LiDAR or photogrammetry to actually sense how deep that duff layer is a limitation of this technology. The way that we are going about it is to look at relationships between the depth of duff and things that can be measured with LiDAR. So LiDAR is very good at picking up stems of trees. So what we're doing is collecting bulk density samples and duff depth samples on transects that extend out from trees so that we can look for relationships between duff bulk density and biomass and the distance from the tree bowl. And so there is, I'm not sure how much of a relationship we can come up with. People have done this in the past and it's not as great as you might expect, but it's how we're approaching this issue. And so that's what you see there is just a diagram of how we're sampling duff. We have 2 transects that extend to the north and south of trees with 3 samples on each side, one right next to the bowl, one under the drip line, and one outside of the drip line. The photos on the right there show how we collect bulk density samples. You can see there's the bulk density square with just litter removed, and finally the duff removed. So that sampling technique not only gives us the biomass, but also the density of that material. So that's 3D fuels in a nutshell. Integrated data sets is the other project that I've been working on quite a bit for the past 2 years. Like I said, the whole point of this is to create a data set that can be used to evaluate CFD models. And so there's really 3 components of this data set. There's collecting data on the fuels, the weather, and fire behavior. If we theoretically have those 3 things, we could take the fuels and weather data, feed that into the CFD, get fire behavior outputs, and then compare that with the fire behavior that we have measured on site to look at how well CFD models are performing. One of the key components to creating these integrated data sets is to have literally everything that is measured georeferenced at a very accurate scale, so they can be overlaid on top of each other. And also for anything where time is important, such as fire behavior or weather data, the time needs to be fairly tightly synchronized. So between those things. So if you can see a difference in fire behavior, you need to know if that gust of wind happened at that same second. Does that change in fire behavior? Because things like weather can affect fire behavior so quickly, you really need to know to a very high degree of precision the relationship in time. So there's a lot to collect with these data sets, and there's not a lot of time to collect it. So before I get into the fire behavior component of it, there's two fuels components of this project that we're also focused on. We're trying to measure fuels with photogrammetry. And so part of that is seeing how well photogrammetry can be used to measure the height of fuels. That's fairly important as far as shrubs and grasses go, as far in terms of how it affects fire behavior. The other thing is mapping fuel moisture. Fuel moisture is very important to how fire behavior, or as far as its influence on fire behavior. And typically, as most of you know, we would just measure fuel moisture for at one location and average out across an entire area. But we all know that fuel moisture can vary at much finer scales than that. So height verification, how are we doing that? We have these 60 by 60 meter plots. On the left there, you can see a 60 by 60 meter plot. Within that plot are 25 2 by 2 meter subplots, I guess you would say. Actually, I'm going to call the 20 by 20 meter a site, and the 2 by 2 meter a plot itself. There's 25 plots. And within each of those 2 by 2 meter plots, we are using photogrammetry to measure the average grass height. And we're physically measuring the grass height to see how well those two correspond with each other. And so this is, in the center there, you can see that's a 2 by 2 meter plot. We measure grass height at 9 different locations within that 2 by 2 meter plot. And we measure grass height in different ways because we're not sure which physical method of measuring grass height correlates best with the way that photogrammetry can be used to measure grass height. So we use visual estimation of grass height, for instance, the tallest piece of grass within a half by half meter plot. And we use these things called pasture meters, which are pretty widely used in agriculture, or at least they were to measure productivity. And in that photo on the right there, there's a plate on the top of that cube, and it's dropped down on top of the grass. The more grass there is, the harder it will be for that plate to fall. So you measure the height of that plate. That gives you a sense of not only the height of the grass, but also its density. So with these height verification plots, we fly them with photogrammetry. We just use a very simple consumer drone. And we generate point clouds in Pix4D. And then we use some MATLAB scripts developed by the Autonomous Flight Systems Laboratory at the University of Washington to calculate height. And then we compare that calculated height with measured height. And like I said, there's many different ways to measure height. So we're trying to figure out which one correlates well with the MATLAB estimated height. And then there's also this graph you can see in the upper right there. There's also some difficult ways, or there's also different ways to measure height. And what this is showing, I'm sorry, I actually go back. There's different ways to use scripts to measure height with point cloud data. And this graph is showing that height varies by quite a bit depending on which method you use. Another part of that is mapping fuel moisture. There's a graduate student at the School of Environmental and Forest Studies that's working with us to use shortwave infrared to map fuel moisture. And these are just some of her preliminary results. That the graph or the plot to look at is the one on the bottom there. And that's using a principal components model to use shortwave infrared and near infrared to map fuel moisture across grassland. And there's actually a bit of a relationship there. There's more work to be done, but it does show promise. And then finally, using integrated data sets to measure fire behavior. This all has to be collected in one day, the day of the burn. And again, we're using 20 by 20 meter plots. We're working with Center for Natural Lands Management on their operational burns. And it requires the collection of location data with high accuracy GPS, pre-fire fuels photogrammetry, fuel moisture, fire behavior video with visible light and thermal IR, post-fire fuels photogrammetry, and then weather data. And then this is an example of some of the data that we have from this summer. This is a grassland burn in southern Washington. On the left, you can see visible light video, and on the right is thermal IR. And this video is just showing you that UAS is just a really great way to be able to measure fire behavior. You would never be able to get this kind of data from a handheld camera. Looking down just gives you a lot of different ways to assess and rate of spread and intensity, and fuel flame depth as well. And then this is a point cloud, a photogrammetric point cloud of that same plot, pre-fire and then post-fire. We're hoping we can subtract the post-fire from the pre-fire to get vegetation height. So how can this be used to advance or help with some of the fire behavior models? The operational models have a lot of limitations. First of all, they don't model underlying combustion processes, or they do not include the atmospheric impacts of wind on fire, at least not at a process level. And they're based on empirical relationships. So they may work great in some settings, but if they're used outside of the conditions they were developed under, probably not going to work so well. They also operate at fairly coarse scales. They're not designed to look at how individual plants or trees will burn, so they can't incorporate some of those finer scale fire behavior processes that could have larger scale impacts on overall fire behavior. CFD models also, they have some limitations as well. While they are process-based and they do incorporate all of the physics needed to model fire behavior, they require a ton of data and they're burdensome to parameterize, at least with data existing ways of collecting data. And the simplified versions that could run on a PC, they're not widely evaluated. So these are dumbed down versions of these CFD models, and it's really unknown like how much these models can be dumbed down before they start losing their accuracy that the full physics-based models have. And the full physics-based models can't be used because they are so computationally intensive. They require supercomputers to run them, and it takes a long time to do a run. So not really applicable for operations. So 3D Fuels is really focused on fulfilling that burdensomeness to parameterize CFD models. That 3D Fuels is really designed to create a process where airborne LiDAR could be used to map fuels at fine scales. And that is that hierarchical sampling approach that is doing that, is sampling fuels at many different levels. Once that is done, that data can be fed into a model or a software program developed by Russ Parsons, again in Missoula, called StandFire, that takes fuels data and generates input files for CFD models. So currently, I think a lot of the way that a lot of the data that StandFire uses is more averaged fuel data, so it doesn't have that real fine scale variability. So that will change with 3D Fuels. And then those are some of the preliminary results from 3D Fuels. One part of the project is being done by Michelle Bester at West Virginia, I believe West Virginia State University. Anyways, in West Virginia, it's creating architecture of shrubs. And then Eric Rowell at Tall Timbers has been able to develop algorithms that can actually predict litter loading from LiDAR returns, which is fairly impressive. And then the integrated data sets is really focused on evaluating CFD models so we can see how accurately they work. And this is an example of a evaluation experiment for CFD models. This is highly instrumented. It is simply a Christmas tree in a warehouse, and it is set on fire. And this is the simulation over here on the right. So this just is a short video. And you can see by watching the two that the CFD models really are able to model fire behavior quite well. If you look at the two images, the fire on the left and right, the simulated fire is behaving very similarly to the actual fire. And those graphs on the right or on the top there are showing loss of fuel and net radiant heat flux. The dots are what's actually happening, and the lines are the simulated, and you can see they're very close to each other. So this past summer, we've collected 3 data sets for fire behavior. And these were more of a proof of concept to see if we could collect everything in a day. And we did pretty good, especially given the pandemic. There was a lot of restrictions on working with people and even doing prescribed burns, because there was a more active stance towards fire suppression this summer. So we didn't really we got a good range of fire behavior on the lower end, as these photos show. The one on the left is barely burning. And the one on the right, we actually had pretty good fire behavior. But in the future, we're looking at sort of beefing up our ability to standardize metadata and have more accurate spatial and temporal reference information. I think also increasing the size from 20 by 20 meters would be helpful. And just getting more interesting fire behavior, more active fire behavior is going to be one of our goals. So that's about it. I just wanted to acknowledge a lot of our partners, projects, the UW School of Environmental Sciences, Autonomous Flight Systems Laboratory at the Department of Aeronautics and Astronautics, Center for Natural Lands Management, Tall Timbers, and the Nature Conservancy have all been partners with some of the work that I've shown here today. So with that, I will turn it over to any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Tim. We have some questions coming through in the Q&A in the chat, so we'll try to get to as many of them as we can and do our best to follow up on the rest. The first question from earlier in your presentation, how did you obtain the point cloud data of the tree seedling using your cell phone? Is there an app, or did you use an attaching sensor or something else?
Yeah, no, so photogrammetry doesn't require any sensors. It is simply looking at the angle of all of the photos, and it stitches them together and can create a 3D model from that. So basically what I did is I took a whole bunch of photos and then used a free computer program called Visual SFM to create the point cloud. And then there's another computer program called Mesh Lab that's also free, that can be used to visualize the data. And also I can't remember the specifics, but there's also some additional processing steps to create that point cloud. And so there's tons of tutorials online to learn how to do that stuff. And there's also more advanced software that you can pay for. Pix4D and Aegisoft Metasoft are 2 that are frequently used.
Great, thank you. Another question, how often will the integrated data sets be updated to account for changing climatic trends and vegetation growth? Are you using any metrics of site productivity, such as heat load index, soil type, along with the vegetation measurements?
Yeah, at this point, that project is mainly focused on just being able to collect all that data in a single day and cooperating with fire management staff. So it's more of a logistics test at this point. We haven't thought that far ahead as far as incorporating some of that data. Our approach to it is also to just be as simple as possible first. So for instance, if you could just take an overhead photo and just simply look at the different colors of the fuels, and you can see how that affects fire behavior, then we would go with that. We would just go with what we just want to see, what is the thing that is having the biggest impact on fire behavior that we can measure very simply. And so no plans to really add increasing complexity to that data at this point, but just plans to increase. The tough part is actually attaching timestamps and geospatial data to all of this data that we collect.
Great, thank you. How much are state agencies that deal with fighting wildfires using these sensors, and how much are they able to afford them?
I'm not sure. I'm probably not the best person to answer that question. The honest answer is I don't know. I have heard anecdotally and seen footage of drones really being used to identify hotspots on fires during active suppression. I think that's one example where UAS is being used for remote sensing on active fires. Obviously, UAS have other uses too, as far as scouting out areas that would be difficult to walk to, and ping pong ball machines can be attached to them so they can be used for ignitions. But yeah, honestly, I don't really know how much state agencies are using these.
Great. And our next question, have you ever used radar and the electric coefficient to measure moisture?
The quick answer is no, we have not done anything with radar yet, but be interested to learn more about that.
Yeah. And it looks like we have time for one more question. This person says, thank you, great presentation. Lots of hope for the future in forest management to minimize fire damage. Do you have any thoughts based on your work?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the work that we're doing, there's some real promise and potential to start using these CFD models in a more of an operational sense. And just right now, they're the full physics-based versions, which are they're not well tested, but because they incorporate all of the physics, there is this assumption that they are working very well to just examine the different ways that fuel arrangements can affect fire behavior. But if these CFD models can be moved to a point where they're being used operationally, it will really change things for how we understand how wildfires will potentially move through different landscapes, and that extends to designing different fuel treatments and understanding what the optimum placement of those is on the landscape to minimize wildfire risk.
Great. Well, we are just about at the top of the hour. So I want to say thank you so much to Jim Cronin for taking the time to talk with us today during this webinar and share your work. And thank you also to all of our participants for joining us today and the great questions. We will be posting a recording of this webinar on the Northwest Fire Science Consortium website, so please look for it there. And if you have any further questions for Jim, please reach out. Thanks so much, everyone. And thank you, Jim.
Yeah, thank you, Shannon. I appreciate it.